very pleased to be here. It's amazing with Zoom how we can, we can traverse the seas and we can do it in that sort of instant. And, some downsides, but there are certainly some upsides like today. In where my focus is on the nature of authenticity and especially R.D. Laing's approach to it. And I'm going to ask, how can we be authentic in a world with other people? How can we be true to ourselves if there's no essential self to be true to? How can we go beyond our false selves? Laing, following Sartre, responds to such conundrums by unmasking, mapping, and revealing patterns of self-deception, or bad faith, as Sartre said. Deceptions and false self-systems in individual and social contexts need to be explored. Laing's approach was existentialist in nature, placing fundamental value on the uniqueness of the individual and their experience. He was no utilitarian. From Laing's perspective, authenticity is good in itself. It's intrinsically valuable and is not good because it has better consequences, even where it does. Maxims such as know thyself and an unexamined life is not worth living reflect foundational ethical values that underline an existentialist approach to human realities. These values are built upon individual freedom, choice, and responsibility, rather than on the consequentialism of the hedonic balances of pleasure and pain. Hedonism, you add up the amount of pleasure and you subtract the amount of pain, or vice versa, and work out what's ethical is how much pleasure comes out in the quotient of that. I'm sure Laing would have agreed with John Stuart Mill's statement. It's better to be a human being dissatisfied than a pig satisfied. Better to be Socrates dissatisfied than a fool satisfied. So it's curious to me that in spite of the fact that the concept of authenticity does pervade Laing's life and writings from The Divided Self, 1960 onwards, Laing didn't often use the term authenticity. He did sometimes, but not that often. For Laing, authenticity is not so much a direct striving for personal truth as much about revealing how we avoid the obvious, that which stands in front of us. We mystifyingly construct false selves and false self systems so as not to see what is obviously going on. Laing was an anti-systematic thinker who focused less on finding the right answers than on asking the right questions. He didn't want to account for the content of a true self so much as to understand how we erect barriers to avoid our freedom. Throughout, Laing is interested in revealing and deciphering the false self systems that stand in the way of our being real. Laing's view of authenticity owed much to the legacy of previous existentialist thinkers. Laing adopted the ideas of Heidegger and Sartre in particular about the foundation of the irreducible freedom that constitutes us. We construct our lives and meaning with no essential self, but rather as active self, as agent. The focus is not on the nature and content of a true self, but instead upon how we construct false selves and illusion, and how we might be able to map and go beyond them. Such a long-standing, difficult and frustrating journey is reflected in this story I've found from the Talmud. And this is the story. A man once got lost in the thick of the forest. For days he tried hopelessly to find his way out, yet it was to no avail. This continued for many weeks and months. One day he came across an old man who was coming toward him. He ran to the stranger and pleaded, "Please tell me how to get out of this forest. I've been wandering for many weeks and months." "My son," the old man replied forlornly, "unfortunately, I too am lost. I have been wandering in this forest not for weeks nor months, but for many years, yet I still have not found the way out. However, before you conclude that any advice I may offer is certainly useless, consider this. Although I may not know the way out of the forest, I can tell you better than anyone which paths lead to nowhere." So I think that Laing was mapping the obstacles and the paths that don't work, that lead nowhere, rather than directly showing the way out. The term authenticity had a bad press in the 1970s. People playing at or pretending to themselves and others to be authentic often came across, ironically, as fake. Wishing, hoping, pretending, instead of recognizing reality and moving on from there sounds, in effect, more authentic. Authenticity was often a buzzword in a language reflecting self-centered, self-absorption, sort of me-generation, a language aiming to express the subdued inner child of pop psychology. But is there something beyond this? The original meaning of being authentic, to thine own self be true, to thine own self be true, is what something really, purely, or genuinely is. As Sartre would have it, authenticity implies being true to one's own set of commitments. This builds upon Jean-Jacques Rousseau's 18th century paradox that we are born free, but are everywhere in chains. For Rousseau, the introduction of private property corrupted the purity of children. Although Rousseau's view is based upon a simplistic view of an essentially good self of noble savages, it serves also to call into question established, taken for granted social hierarchical assumptions. Laing immersed himself early in reading the existentialists. For Laing, Sartre was a gate opener to the other existentialists. He read Sartre's Being and Nothingness, which was published in 1943 originally, and Being and Nothingness built upon many of Heidegger's concepts before he read Heidegger, before Laing read Heidegger. Heidegger's classic Being and Time appeared 16 years earlier in 1927. Although the concept of authenticity used in existential philosophy originated with Kierkegaard's book, Sickness Unto Death, it was expounded classically in Heidegger's Being and Time. Heidegger actually coined the term Eigenlichkeit, translated early as authenticity from the ordinary German word eigentlich, meaning actually, truly, or really, which built upon the German word eigen, as you could imagine, means own or proper, so self. For Heidegger, authenticity involves owning up to who we are, or being one's own, the quality of ownedness, disowning it is authentic. Disowning it is authentic, that we don't own ourselves. For Heidegger, the noise of the world covers up and distracts us from the uncanniness of our being in the world. Recognizing this uncanniness allows us to further experience our fallenness and ourselves as thrown in our essential estrangement. Thus, a sense of estrangement or alienation from others for Heidegger is a good, not a bad thing, because it represents a basis for becoming attuned to our authentic mode of being, rather than being absorbed into the world of the they or others. In Heidegger's account, to be uniquely human involves our agency, whereby we shape our identity, realizing our individual human distinctiveness through owning and realizing our overarching projects for the sake of ourselves. Heidegger, who built upon Nietzsche's ideas of the will to power and the Übermensch, the overman, who could justify humanity's existence and overcome and realize him or herself, opposes any concept of realizing a pre-given essential self or good or inner child, and that's good or bad. It opposes any concept of realizing any pre-given essential self. For Heidegger, humans are beings whose being is in question, and we have no essence. According to Heidegger, authenticity is an ongoing process. It's a narrative we construct for ourselves. It's a narrative we construct for ourselves from an ineffable base from which we actively attempt to realize our goals. Laing characterized Heidegger's enigmatic conception of truth as what he said was that which is literally without secrecy. That which is literally without secrecy. Along the same lines, Sartre suggested that the world can be divided into existence, to two categories: existence or being for itself on the one hand, and essence or being in itself on the other. According to Sartre, only humans have the character of existence, and things have an essence. Sartre mapped this central idea of a non-essential self as patterns of self-deception, based upon how we try to avoid the freedom to which we are all condemned. Authenticity means recognizing not having an essential pre-given false self. And this fact determines the patterns of inauthenticity. Sartre's clearest insights are about treating ourselves as choosing beings, as free beings, not as things. According to Sartre, we often try to escape into seeing ourselves or others as things instead of seeing ourselves as choosing beings with their own axes of orientation. As I mentioned, Sartre posits two kinds of being in itself and being for itself, being and nothingness, being as that which is and nothingness as a gap in being, an indefinable free agent that can't get away from having to choose, whether you like it or not. And most of us don't like it, according to Sartre. Sartre sees self-deception, mauvaise foi, as a project that aims at escaping freedom. Sartre proposes different patterns of self-deception in treating ourselves or others as objects or things. He instances a waiter who tries too hard in pretending to be a waiter, overacting the role of waiter, almost as a caricature. Another example, the woman on a first date who pretends that her hand being grasped by her date is not really her hand. something that is her, but instead it's as though it's not really her hand or something that's her, but instead a separate object out there in the world that things just happen to. She is trying to dissociate, to disown herself, to distance the action, to treat part of herself as a mechanistic object. Pretending not to be able to make choices is itself a choice, and disowning ourselves is inauthentic. There's no way to prescribe being authentic. Heidegger and Sartre don't prescribe how to behave so much as describing ways not to, as I suggested. Sartre's fictional trilogy of the 1940s, The Roads to Freedom, describes the paradoxes and complexities of different paths we pursue in evading our freedom, and how authentic freedom can come only upon recognizing false ways of being, recognizing the paths not to go down. That is an ethic of owning oneself and one's behavior and not disowning it. As Heidegger puts it, we are the beings whose being is in question, and as Sartre puts it, we're not free not to be free. Authenticity needs to be a self-serving overvaluation of oneself. Need not be, I'm sorry, authenticity need not be a self-serving overvaluation of oneself. It can be transcending, reaching out beyond where one is to the world of others in terms of fulfillment of one's overarching projects in relationship between self and others. For both Sartre and Heidegger, authenticity lies in my owning up to my freedom and choices. Laing sketches the way we encumber ourselves or are framed by others into not seeing what is going on, or not seeing the paths out from which we don't want to be. Sartre thinks choosing is unfathomable in itself, but as choosing beings, we are saddled with having to choose and make choices. For Sartre, we are our choices, we are our actions, we're not our intentions. For Sartre, while we are alive, we can change ourselves by changing our choices and actions. At the same time as we're irredeemably choose, we can't not choose, we're also encumbered with commensurate and inescapable responsibility for our actions together with their consequences. We are what we do and cannot avoid bearing the consequences. Indeed, I think that authenticity involves being responsible not only for your choices and actions, but also not turning a blind eye to their probable consequences and taking them into account. I've just outlined Lang's indebtedness to the major existential thinkers whose thought formed the foundation of his approach to authenticity. Let's now look more directly at Lang's ideas. Authenticity is always implicit as underlining Lang's approach, but because he does not often explicitly discuss it, it's not as easy to directly examine it in the same way as you would if he had. Nonetheless, there are some clear indicators. The Divided Self, 1960, is based on the assumption of authenticity. Signs of persons for Lang explicitly recognize the difference between seeing somebody as a free human being and seeing them as a mechanism. The concepts of true and false self and false self systems explain ways that people deceive themselves and others that they are not making choices. For Laing, mental illness is far more intelligible in terms of the meaning and choices patients make, so that such choices can be deciphered, decoded, unmasked, or unveiled. In The Divided Self, Laing draws upon existentialist thinkers, particularly Sartre on self-deception, to explain the differences between explicit, authentic choices and false and inauthentic choices, which can be revealed in terms of false self confusions. According to Laing, the schizophrenic's vulnerable true self does not feel it is participating in the activities of the false self systems which mask it. For the Laing of The Divided Self, the psychotic is understood in terms of attempts to solve existential problems through the use of the person's ineluctable freedom and subjectivity. In this, Laing is a firm follower of Sartre. The hysterics dissociations are, for Laing, best described as Sartre's concept of self-deception I've talked about before. Laing sees much of schizophrenia as, and I quote Laing, simply nonsense, red herring speech, prolonged filibustering to throw dangerous people off the scent, to create boredom and futility in others. The schizophrenic is often making a fool of himself and the doctor. He is playing at being mad to avoid at all costs the possibility of being held responsible for a single coherent idea or intention, he says. This authentic behaviour is seen to be more of a way out than usually thought. As Laing puts it, the false self is one way of not being oneself. Laing goes on to list a number of important existentialist studies relevant to which he says are relevant to understanding the false self as one way of living inauthentically. Now, to understand ourselves only from the vantage point of our consciousness of what's going on is normally to be mistaken. Authenticity is based on the nature of the unknown self, alignment with it, and expression of it. How can we listen or pay attention to ourselves honestly and speak candidly? Laing cites Euripides in the Phoenician Women. And Euripides said 2,500 years ago, a slave is a man who dares not speak his thoughts. A slave is a man who dares not speak his thoughts. Laing conveyed a romantic vision of schizophrenia in a later book, The Politics of Experience. It even seemed at the time, and this is 1967, it even seemed at the time as though ordinary people were, as such, inauthentic and false, not just living in little boxes, but as neo-Marxist philosopher Herbert Marcuse suggested in One-Dimensional Man, all of us in the first world were so alienated as to not recognize that we were alienated at all. That's a kind of double alienation, alienated from our alienation. In this situation, it seemed to Laing that somehow schizophrenics might be able to glimpse a way out into authenticity. They weren't captured in the same way. And this way out into authenticity, albeit through a tiny pane of glass darkly. Although Laing contributed to the romanticization of the mentally ill as finding their true selves and challenging false selves, he also mapped the nature of authenticity as agency and ways out of living alienated lives. On this basis, it's easy to see why, for Laing, mad people would stand out. However, the inner self is neither good nor bad, but ineffable, uncanny. This implies that the terms true and false self are confusing and misleading because neither one is exclusively true or false. For example, a false self may be a misnomer, as it is really a social self we need for getting along with others in daily living. The paradoxes of freedom question the simple romantic notion of some kind of essential self. In my view, the Laing of the politics of experience traversed romantic Rousseauian territory by idealizing madness and seeing mad people as what his Kingsley Hall colleague Joe Burke labelled a sort of emotional proletariat. I think that's a wonderful expression, that the mentally ill were a sort of emotional proletariat, as in Karl Marx, his theory of class struggle. Laing gave credence to such romantic notions in the politics of experience, where the split of us and them meant that we were good and they were bad, and that schizophrenics were akin to Renaissance explorers. Mary Barnes's famous journey through madness was charted as a search for authenticity. I don't think anybody who knew Mary Barnes thought she succeeded that well. Laing was allergic to anything fake or counterfeit. He reacted, even seriously overreacted, to a sense of lack of genuineness. But he really appreciated the genuine article and resonated with a genuine person, such as a schizophrenic patient with whom he was able to relate in a natural way. He liked plain speaking and wrote in words of one syllable, mercifully, actually. Laing began and ended with individuality. He emphasized the values of authenticity, candidness, honesty, straightforwardness, being who you are without pretense. The idea of the asylum communities, such as Kingsley Hall, was that they were havens, crucibles of experience, where people could be themselves, often uncomfortably rubbing up against others, hopefully without harming them. It rested on the idea that people could be respected for being who they were. We need a community in order to be authentic. On his tour of the US in 1972, Laing recalled that he was often asked by students, how do we get in touch with our feelings? That degree of alienation from who we are, that we can, as a matter of fact, they not only asked, how do we get in touch with our feelings, but said, well, should we do that now or wait until we graduate? So that degree of alienation from who we are, that we can be strangers to ourselves, was an alarm signal. This was a time when childbirth could be seen as simply a medical procedure under the gaze of a scientific look, and not as a meaningful life event. Laing valued the individual highly as a unique, free being whom we couldn't presume to know at bottom. We are all different and we can't mind read. Although we, as much as we'd like to, or other people would like us to, although we shouldn't presume to know what the other person is thinking, we can have an intuitive sense of it, I suppose, through empathy. Laing is, though, if you like, a methodological individualist, not a collectivist. Along with other existentialists, he begins from the standpoint and unique value of the individual and their experience, and then works outwards and upwards to more social and collective concepts. But, like Sartre, he never abandons the focus on the individual's experience together with the actions and consequences of that stance within collective psychosocial systems. Society. This is where authenticity is crucial to understanding the foundation of individual actions and interactions, labeling and the impacts of the social systems we inhabit. This was always a challenge. There is no pre-given fit And Laing is far more Freud than Marx in his understanding of the inherent tensions in relationships and society that cannot be resolved. Laing begins with the intuitions of existentialists and respect for the individual's unique experience and agency. Sartre followed this path from individual through to social system, inquiring as to how it is possible to be authentic in systems in which we may not be aware of its rules, of their rules, injunctions, and structures. How can we situate choice within the types of groups in which we live, such as the family? However, for Laing, no individual is just an island, unto itself. It always exists. The individual always exists within a context. The context is what Sartre would call the term a situation. Sartre's collected essays are called situations. But their individuality is still there, even if constrained or alienated. The individual needs to be comprehended in context. Our consciousness is always consciousness of something. That context is the internal context of different and mostly unconscious aspects of self. But that context needs to be comprehended within the relationship of self and other. Again, self and other, that's two, are situated within a family or group context. So two is situated within a group. And the family exists within this system of society, and that within the total social world system that Laing talks about. And that total social world system, again, exists within a spiritual or cosmological context. So it's all to do with the context of context of context, which again, affect the individual, and what is the individual in those contexts in terms of their power and their being. Much of Laing's life lies avowedly in the zone of communications theory and research, exploring the possibility of mapping the patterns of relationships in the human world and investigating how we might be able to see the ground clearly enough to individually flourish. This approach involves understanding and revealing from the position of the individual not only the rules of the game, but untangling the meta rules, the meta rules, and so on into spiraling meta contexts. There's a context and the context of a context, the context of that context, etc. And you get lost in this sort of hall of mirrors. If we don't know who we are, at least we might know some of the things we aren't. We will always act with limited knowledge given factors such as the unconscious and social impacts that we are not aware of. We can do the best we can, honestly, straightforwardly, owning up to the responsibility for our actions. So I want now to outline what I think is Laing's only explicit and considered, albeit brief, discussion about his approach to authenticity. In Self and Others, Laing, the original was in, just around in the early 60s. Laing gets to the heart of what inauthentic or alienated action is. It is about putting oneself into a false or untenable position, or being put into such positions. Laing equates inauthenticity with what he calls being in a false existential position. He cites colloquialisms and everyday speech that demonstrate our experience of place and position in our world. People can put themselves into their acts or may not be in them, or we may lose or forget ourselves or are full of ourselves or beside ourselves, or, I guess we could be lost, all attributions about the person's relation to their own actions. In all of them, the issue is, and I quote Laing, the extent to which the act is seen or felt to potentiate the being or existence of the doer, or the extent to which the action makes patent the latent sense of self, the latent self of the doer, unquote. Laing suggests that we feel we are going forward when we put ourselves into our actions, when we disclose or make patent our true self, or we may be liable to feel that we are going back, going round in circles, getting nowhere. Thus, Laing submits, in putting myself into what I do, I lose myself, and in so doing, I seem to become myself. The act I do is felt to be me, and I become me in and through such action. Also, there's a sense in which a person keeps himself alive by his acts. Each act can be a new beginning, a new birth, a recreation of oneself, he says. In a rare comment directly, again, on authenticity, Laing goes on to explain, to be authentic is to be true to oneself, to be what one is, to be genuine. To be inauthentic is to not be oneself, to be false to oneself, to be not as one appears to be counterfeit. We tend to link the categories of truth and reality by saying that a genuine act is real, but that a person who habitually uses actions as a masquerade is not real, end quote. Laing sees the self-disclosure of authenticity as being what Nietzsche meant by the will to power, and he explains, Laing explains, it is the weak man who, in lieu of potentiating himself genuinely, counterfeits his impotence by dominating and controlling others, by idealizing physical strength or sexual potency. For Laing, I may feel fulfilled by an act that is genuine, revealing and potentiating in an act that is me. In this action, I am myself. I put myself in it. Insofar as I put myself into what I do, I become myself through this doing. Conversely, I feel empty when it is not my doing. Citing Heidegger, Laing contrasts two notions of truth. First notion is that there's a natural scientific concept that consists of the correspondence of what goes on in the mind and what happens in the world. The second notion of truth that Heidegger writes about derives from the pre-Socratic concept of aletheia, which is that which is without secrecy, what discloses itself without a veil. What if the inauthentic person, the person in a false position, isn't aware of being in such a position? The person can only experience his or her position as false to the extent that he or she is not totally estranged from their own experience and actions. Laing vividly describes the consequences of this false position of inauthenticity, and I quote him. Perhaps without his realizing it, his life comes to a stop. With no real future of his own, he may be in that supreme despair, which is, as Kierkegaard says, not to know he is in despair. That's a supreme despair, which is to not know that you're in despair. He is in despair because he has lost his own future, and so can have no genuine hope or trust in any future. The person in a false position has lost a starting point of his own from which to throw or thrust himself, that is, to project himself forward. He has lost the place. He does not know where he is or where he is going. He cannot get anywhere, however hard he tries. In despair, just as one place is the same as another, so one time is the same as another. The future is the resultant of the present. The present is the resultant of the past, and the past is unalterable. End quote. This is scarcely a good way to be. Although authenticity can be an uncomfortable way to be, it can have its rewards in terms of being alive, real, genuine, a sense of being one's own unique self, and ownership of actions and better relationships. However, authenticity comes at a cost. It goes with being confronted and living with the human condition. Confronted with the human condition, living with it. The world which Freud masterfully outlined in Civilization and its Discontents, the inevitable pain and suffering of life, the realities of our vulnerability to our own bodies, to other people, to the perils of nature, and to mortality. However, then there are the perils of authenticity. What is the cost of being authentic, of authenticity? It can make us uncomfortable and incapable of being honest when we have a real fear of other people, especially in a politically correct or otherwise more directly oppressive social context. There is no pat answer here. It's a balance. How much authenticity can we get away with? Can it be authentic then to go along, to get along? Such conundrums will, I hope, make for a great discussion now. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Doug.
Yeah,
so, now we have an opportunity. We have a good 30 plus minutes to jump in with the discussion. So I'll keep my eyes open on all of you. Anyone wants to open up with a question or comment?
How do you raise your hand on this platform? Is that, I noticed some people had a little hand came up.
Yeah,
You're strict to that?
Yeah, there's a reaction button at the bottom of your screen.
A reaction button?
There's reactions.
Ah.
So try that. And then there you go.
Right.
Yes. Yes, Mike, I see your hand if you want to jump in.
That was an authentic moment. Well, thanks so much, Doug. That was quite a lot to think about. You covered a very broad platform of ideas. One thing that I did, and you said this fairly early, I just wanted to ask you about, where you were citing that Laing had said that authenticity is I think you said a value in itself, something worth pursuing in and of itself rather than as a step towards some goal. And that made me think about Plato and Aristotle's views about happiness, that they felt happiness was the ultimate goal in life, that you don't become happy in order, like let's say to be rich or successful or popular, that we do everything in life in order to further personal happiness. And I think that that's something that really comes up with the notion of authenticity, because as you were pointing out towards the end, authenticity comes at a cost. You may lose friends or popularity over being authentic. So there's got to be something about why we pursue it. that can't just be a concept. And I guess my view is that we want to be authentic because it is something that furthers happiness. That if you're not authentic, if you're not true to yourself, basically if you're not honest, let's say, with yourself and others, then how can you be happy with yourself? So I just wondered what your thoughts were about that authenticity in effect is a kind of honesty.
Yeah, I think it is. The point is, it's not on the way to something else. It's not like, as I said, Laing wasn't a utilitarian. A utilitarian, as famously is, the greatest happiness to the greatest number, or variations of that, so that you can have, if you like, a felicity calculus. You add up the advantages or the good hedons that you get from doing something or other. Like you say, well, I go out to eat at this great restaurant. Well, it's going to cost this much, and it's going to put on this much weight, and it's going to do all this. On the other hand, it's going to be a lot of fun, and it's going to be this and that. And so I work it out, and we make these decisions all the time. Am I going to get the economy on aircraft, or will I get, will I go by train? And what's the difference? How do I work it out? What's going to make us happier? So what's going to produce the most pleasure and the least pain. And if you think about it, I always come back actually to one of Freud's great concepts. I think it's the pleasure principle, because it's the pleasure-unpleasure principle, actually. And that is that it's not the final. It's not a final desideratum. It's not the final thing we want to get to, but it is something that we use quite a bit, and often we avoid unpleasantness. So we can feel better from that, and so we avoid it not because it's true or it's the best way or whatever, but because it's the least pleasant. So you've got a lot of stuff about pleasure that's involved with that. And there's another way of looking at it, and that's to do with flourishing. And that's more the old Greek stuff, and happiness. And it's the idea that we can become what we potentially are, or can be. What we can grow, and we can flourish, we can expand, we can. You find that a lot. You find that in philosophy, in the way Hegel, for example, you get constant idea of the more conscious you are, the more you can flourish, and the more you can be more aware of yourself and aware of what's going on. That's intrinsically a value. And you get with Sartre and with the existentialists all the time, better that you could be unhappy as long as it's you could value yourself, even if you could sort of give up who you are and make lots of money and do all sorts of things. Very often we will say, no, I'd rather be myself with all the terrible things about it, etc. So it's not being true to yourself in a funny way. I think being authentic is not it's not something that you've actually achieved. It's something that's always a challenge, and it's a process, I think. that you will constantly have, and it isn't because you're happier with it in a pleasure sense, but you might be more satisfied in a more whole sense. I think most of us have an idea of what that means.
Well, I think Stephen just made a note in the chat about eudaimonia, which is Aristotle's idea of flourishing. I think even Freud abandoned the pleasure principle as a model of happiness with the death drive, because he recognized that in order to be happy, you have to suffer. Just
Sure.
like in order to be authentic, you have to be willing to suffer. There's a price to be paid. And so although naturally you wouldn't say that misery is a path to happiness, we are seeking a pleasurable life to the degree that we're able to have it. But in order to have it, we have to make tough choices, as you say, and to be true to ourselves, to be honest, to not walk around with a guilty conscience, and that happiness isn't just feeling happy. Happiness is our life. It's not just a momentary emotion. And I think that in that sense, authenticity is the same. It's not so much this moment or that moment that you're being authentic. Your life as a whole is furthering being authentic. But as we all, as Heidegger would say, for the most part, we're inauthentic, in our day-to-day dealings with people. That doesn't mean we're inauthentic people. So I think that that's the only thing I would add. I don't want to hog up all this discussion time. I just wanted to give that footnote on the notion of pleasure and happiness.
Yeah, I would just say something very briefly, which is that I think Freud was, with the pleasure principle, I think it's a very profound, let's say, observation about the way people often go. That's the thing. Now, it's not that he thought all we've got to do is get pleasure. Well, for sure he didn't.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
But it is an observation of how a lot of people actually work. It's not something that actually is that successful.
Mm-hmm.
The pleasure principle. Well, that's very attractive.
Looks like Stephen has his hand up, his magical hand. Go ahead, Stephen.
Just to follow up on what's been said about the pleasure, pain, and the idea of happiness more as a flourishing or a manifesting of one's potential. I'm so excited to be a part of this because Laing was such an important part of my studies in psychology back in the 70s, and came to Sartre much later. And now, understanding Sartre really helps me to understand what Laing was up to. But I see Sartre as a very Nietzschean character, somebody who had taken Nietzsche's idea of self-overcoming very, very seriously, and sort of is heroic in his own way, and how the engaged intellectual. And for me, the idea of self-overcoming does involve pain and struggle with one's socialization and one's conditioning and growing up in a particular time and place, and then trying to take that raw material of one's upbringing and make something of it, like transcend it or make something artful of it. And so that's not going to be a bed of roses. It's not going to be a particularly easy thing often, but there's great satisfaction overall in doing that difficult work.
The path less chosen, right? It's yeah.
I think that there's this great quotation from Camus in The Plague. Somebody asks the hero, Dr. Rieu, how he came to get all the knowledge he got. And he said in one word, suffering.
Mm-hmm. That's very Buddhist, isn't it?
It's the only way of getting anywhere is through having to face what's going on and taking it in one's stride somehow or other, or not, but trying to anyway.
I wanted to make a comment on that, which is, one of the things that a theme that I felt you highlighted, described very well, was the distinction between authenticity as this idea that you're being true to this sort of essential true self, but rather that it's actually this way of accepting, putting yourself into the world and experiencing yourself in relation to the world is how it seemed to me. And I would think that whereas, just being, true to some essential true self is sort of just, opening up to, just feel good about yourself, open up to it and feel good about it, be open to it. But this other view of that, authenticity is, it's not really, as you were saying, this self-serving overvaluation of oneself, but it can also be this transcending and sort of reaching into the world. And of course, that means you have to have suffering in that, right? Because you have to suffer the world. The world isn't just how you like it. So
it's not narcissistic.
Right. And so I felt, I did feel that was the way you explained all of that. I felt was so important because it's, authenticity, I think it's too often mistaken for narcissism, and it totally misses
opposite
point. Yeah. So, but anyways, I just wanted to make that comment.
I think it's a sort of, thank you. I think it's a sort of, it's really true. That's why I said it was a buzzword, especially in the 60s, 70s. And, I'm an authentic, being. So I'm sort of superior to you. It's a sort of early version of virtue signaling, really.
Do your own thing.
I'm the best.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas actually, it's tough, it's like looking at the reality and then trying to work out where you go within the reality, even where there aren't clear paths. It's like, as Sartre said at one point, never were we freer than under the Nazi occupation. Because every word you said, every thought you had almost was going to be for or against the Nazis. It's got consequences. If you betrayed somebody or if you opened your mouth in certain circumstances, you knew what was going to happen, So, and there are times when you were clear, you were either for or against, and that was the way it was, and you could know where you were going and feel satisfied with that. But then he said that actually the world is more complex than that. And in fact, you can end up being deceived about what the choices are, and even the data that you've got. You could be hoodwinked, and then you don't know where you're going. You don't know where you're going, and you might think but you don't know. Those sort of problems, and that comes through, with Laing a lot in the family. That people get get tangled in webs. That's one of the things that is important, that you get webs of deceit, which people are involved with, and they might be perpetuating unknowingly these webs and going in the wrong direction, but not knowing it until afterwards, or maybe they couldn't have known it. And what do? It's just like, unfortunately, I think a lot of it is that Sartre or Laing or the existentialists are not making things more difficult by telling it. It makes it more difficult for a person. They might feel more confused, but it's the reality of the situation where you're faced with real choices where there isn't a clear way out, or if there is a clear way out, it could be a wrong way out. So you're befuddled, really. And on the other hand, for Sartre and Laing, you can't escape it. You can't escape your choices by the fact that you don't know where they're going to go, and you don't know what the best way is, because you're still saddled with having to make a choice, or by default making a choice, whether you like it or not. So you better kind of like that's tough, but it's the way things are.
Well, I think that was something maybe why the Frankfurt School was so opposed to authenticity. They took it to be narcissism. And I think that is the conundrum. How do you distinguish between a person who's being authentic and simply narcissistic? Because it is about the relation to the self, but also the relation to others, as you were pointing out earlier, like the houses, Kingsley Hall. It was, on the one hand, a place where you could go there and be yourself without having to conform to conventional norms. On the other hand, you are also there to be part of a community, to find your place in that community, without having to be encumbered with arbitrary rules. Well, how do you thread that needle? That's something we all struggle with in our relationships to friends, to marriages, to colleagues. How do you be true to yourself and yet not be a jerk, with everybody else? That is the challenge, I think, and that's not so easy to define. Anyway,
well, we have Susanna, and
Susanna said
we
had a
will
comment.
maybe have time for one or two more. So if anyone hasn't had a chance to say something, like to get ready. So Susanna, do you want to talk about that question?
Yeah, just what comes to mind is, it seems behind the scenes for me is a whole sense of purpose and meaning. That authenticity points to that. I think narcissism is sort of the shadow aspect of that, but when we have a sense of authenticity, or even get close to something like that, it's because something's meaningful, something is connected to our sense of purpose. Those are just what comes up for me in the discussion.
That's good. I think you're absolutely right. I think it gives you a sense of meaning. But one of the problems is, it was in terms of what's been said before, I think it's very important, a sense of purpose, a sense of all that. And what I mentioned before about Sartre's trilogy of the roads to freedom, the Le Chemin de la Liberté, in the 1940s, that he was in the first one, The Age of Reason. I think they're wonderful books, actually. In the first one, he was very, I think it was sort of somewhat autobiographical, really, but the protagonist in the first one was called Mathieu, and he felt he didn't have a purpose. He felt like he didn't feel any solidity. He felt like jelly. He felt like he had no inner self. He was just sort of wandering around and moving from one thing to another, just sort of sliding in a sort of a bit of a daze, and not being able to work out exactly which way to go and what was right and what was wrong and everything. And at the same time, counterposed to Mathieu was the communist Brunet, who was exactly the opposite of that. He was solid. He had he could shake hands, just solidity and strength, because that's another thing. Mathieu felt he was weak, whereas Brunet, the communist, was strong. He knew where he was going. He knew what was right. He knew what was wrong, and he could forcefully, go forward and into the very bright future and do his own, and make achievements and that kind of thing. Of course, the problem with Brunet was that he was deceiving himself about this. If it was really true, that would be one thing. And we know too much about Stalin and so on. But, there is the attraction of having a meaning that's given to you, or that you adopt, you make it your own. And you say, I'm going to, work for the working class. I've got the strength of the working class behind me, or the big mass communist party behind me, and I can strive future realistically for in the way forward. Whereas so part of the authenticity is, if you can get meaning, yes, that's good. But what if it's a false meaning? What if it's just a kind of meaning that gives you pleasure? Like we're talking about with the utilitarians, that you feel happier, you feel like you've got some meaning in your life, even though it's a false meaning. So an authentic person has got to be able to deal with, on the one hand, trying to find meaning in their lives and owning themselves, and on the other, not succumbing to something which is a completely, which is a way of avoiding your freedom, of using the meaning as a way of avoiding your ineffable being.
Yeah, false idols. Yes.
Yeah.
And we have Astrea up next.
And then Stephen.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you very much, Doug. It was great. It's kind of late here in Brazil, so I'm a little bit, it's 11:20 now.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah.
Wow.
Time to have dinner for you.
Amazing, huh?
So I was trying to approximate suffering and authenticity. Difficult experiences in life, especially in childhood. And then when you get close to those like traumas, then you would be more authentic. That's what I'm thinking about. So suffering and authenticity and difficult experiences, especially in childhood. And then when you're an adult, then you can face those experiences and be more authentic. So when I think about someone who, as we were talking, like Michael was saying, a jerk, I think this person would never be authentic because it's full of defenses. They never face their difficult experiences in life. What do you think about this?
Mm.
I'm trying, there are
Well,
many thoughts in my mind, so.
Oh, I love that. I mean, of course, that's right out of Nietzsche, isn't it? I will to power, I think he's saying desire to passion. And passion, as we know, etymologically means suffering. Nietzsche was really into suffering as the path to authenticity and happiness in a way that's quite unique. I don't think anyone else goes nearly that far in placing that as such a premium part of it. But yeah, I think that's, of course, it's passion is more complicated than that, obviously. But yeah, I love that, Estrella.
Yeah, that's good. A patient, of course, is a patient is also, you know, passion, it's suffering, it's all of that, which is what you undergo something, and you have to undergo something to get through it somehow. And I guess it's, as you say, Australia, it's not something, you know, like we're children, you know, children and adults, we go right through the time. And actually, Sartre didn't have children. It was almost like everybody was born as an adult. And so they'd all be making choices and so on, in the way he described it. And in a way, you could say the world he maps is actually better in some ways than the actual world, because it's more confusing, you know, because we've got childhood involved, you know, childhood and adolescence and growing and developing and everything, and childhood, you know, infancy. So we're always making choices one way or another, but but our brains are not up to being able to work out these things. So it's very, very much more complicated. And then, as you say, Australia, you know, when you're older, and we all go into analysis when we're older, or, you know, in adolescence or a bit older, and then we think, what was going on there? And then try to look at it. But we were making choices all along, whether we like it or not. And we're stuck with that. That's one of the things Sartre talks about quite a bit, is this finality and counter-finality, that you go, you aim at doing something, and it might be that what you're putting your life into and everything, or ends up that it has the opposite effect, and then you're responsible for that. So tough.
Yeah, but the nice thing about choices is you can always change your mind. It's you know,
They
that's,
might be a bit late sometimes.
that
It's not just
otherwise-
death. I mean, Sartre said death is the future bard, but you can't, you know, if you've got it killed, you know, if you were Putin, for example, and, you know, you killed countless, tens of thousands of people, and then afterwards you just say, oh, well, I've changed my mind. I think I'll really take myself to a monastery or something or other. Would that be okay? Once I've learnt something, I've made, you know, Elizabeth Holmes has just been convicted. You know, she's made some rather large mistakes in her life. What about, you know, now if she does say, I'm remorseful, I've changed my mind, I'm changing from the rest, this is a good thing for sure. But on the other hand, she did, you know, what she did, whether she meant to or she didn't mean to or whatever, had the consequences for, you know, billions of dollars. So I don't know. It's hard to know. It's tough.
Did you see Stephen's question, Doug? I think that's
No.
Stephen, do you want to?
Yeah, I wasn't sure whether I'd have another chance to say something, so I wrote it in the chat.
Oh,
Basically, it was about, I seem to recall that Sartre said that the ego is actually an object in consciousness. And this sort of resonates with me, this sort of my Buddhist practice and what came out of the 70s, psychedelic, trying to transcend or, break through to the other side. And Laing was a big part of that with the politics of experience. And so I just wondered if there's anything to be said about the ego as this thing that constrains us, we invest ourselves in being this separate self, and when that becomes its own form of inauthenticity or suffering, unnecessary.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Lacan would agree with that. And, I think Lacan was very influenced by Sartre. He doesn't acknowledge it so much, but he was very close to him. Sartre was dominant in French psychiatry and psychoanalysis and philosophy in France. And, that doesn't come out of structural linguistics. That comes out of an existential heritage. But absolutely, pre-reflective consciousness, reflective consciousness, that the ego is not the seat of the self.
Well, the famous statement, where it was, ego shall be.
There I become.
And then they've changed, people have gone back and said, well, when you look at it, when you look at what Freud said, it really was something like, where it was, there I will go. So that's very different. It's inverting it. So
Completely different.
Totally different.
Yes, and that we, especially when you take the unconscious seriously, that we, Freud said, that we're responsible for our dreams. That's an interesting comment. We don't know what we don't know. We don't know what we don't know. And, what we know is only, some sort of subsection of, of all this. So really, if we're responsible, I own my dreams, they're mine, but then I've got to go to where the origins of the dreams are. So that's the exploring. And that may be that I have to go through the communications issues, like Stephen, you mentioned about the psychedelic issues, and Laing was, as you say, was rather into all this stuff, that is a path to finding out about yourself, things about yourself, and it might be fundamental things about yourself that you really don't know. And that's also true of analysis too.
Well, Freud also said that we're conscious when we're dreaming. That we're asleep, but we're conscious.
Mm.
It's